Okay, we've got a lot to cover, so let's just dive right into this. Today, we are cracking open the recently declassified vaults of the Central Intelligence Agency to look at what has to be one of the most secretive and, honestly, unsettling programs of the entire Cold War. We're exploring the history of Project Artichoke. Let me just kick things off with a pretty wild question. And seriously, I want to be totally clear here. This is not some plot pulled from a spy novel. This comes directly from the government's own historical records. Could a person be programmed to commit an assassination against their will? Now, I know that sounds like pure science fiction, right? But for the CIA back in the early 1950s, answering this question became an absolute top priority scientific objective. Just listen to the exact wording from this declassified 1954 memo. Can an individual be made to perform an act of attempted assassination involuntarily under the influence of artichoke? What's so striking here is the sheer clinical, almost boring bureaucratic tone they use to discuss something so incredibly extreme. But to really grasp how the US government got to this point, we have to look at the intense, paranoid context of that era. All right, let's jump into Section 1, Cold War Brainwashing Fears. You know, pretty much every massive government program starts because someone somewhere is trying to solve a problem. In the early 1950s, the American intelligence community was facing what they genuinely believed was an existential threat. The real catalyst here was the Korean War. American prisoners of war were making televised, coerced confessions to war crimes, things like bacteriological warfare, and the US government was absolutely terrified. They objectively feared that the Soviets and the Chinese had made these massive, unprecedented leaps in psychological coercion and brainwashing, so they felt this urgent need to respond. They had to figure out if the human mind could literally be hacked, both to protect their own agents from breaking, and of course to use those exact same techniques against their adversaries. Now, if you've ever felt completely lost in the alphabet soup of CIA cryptonyms, because there are a lot of them, this timeline really clears up the rapid escalation of all this. It all started in 1950 with Project Bluebird, which was mainly focused on special interrogation methods. But just a year later, in 1951, that evolved into Project Artichoke, which expanded into much broader behavior control. And then by 1953, the whole shebang was absorbed into the now infamous Project MK-Ultra. Moving on to Section 2, the birth of Artichoke. So this is the point where the CIA formally organized their efforts and really began shifting toward extreme scientific experimentation. And we see this crucial shift in their goals. At first, the initial goals were strictly defensive, basically protecting US agents from enemy interrogation. How do we make sure our guys don't spill secrets if they get caught? But very quickly, almost alarmingly quickly, it morphed into offensive goals. They wanted to extract confessions from enemy defectors, and even more radically, they wanted to create programmable agents. It's wild to see how fast the mission crept from defensive survival right into the hubris of trying to actively, offensively control human behavior. So who was actually running this? The key figures here included Morse Allen, who initially led the security side of things, and Sidney Gottlieb, a chemist who spearheaded the CIA's technical services staff. These were highly educated clinical officials operating with immense secrecy and, honestly, virtually zero outside oversight. To them, the human mind was essentially just another battlefield terrain that needed to be conquered. Which brings us to Section 3, Interrogation and Mind Control. So what were Gottlieb and his team actually doing out there in the field? How were they trying to break down the walls of the human psyche? Well, they relied super heavily on a cocktail of extreme pharmacological tools. We're talking LSD, sodium amytal, scopolamine, and amphetamines. And here is a really surprising historical fact for you. The pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly actually developed a process to manufacture LSD in tonnage quantities back in the 1950s, and they became a primary supplier for the CIA. The agency was desperately searching for the perfect truth serum, or some kind of drug that could induce 100% total compliance. One of the main methods they came up with was called narco-hypnosis. This is basically the combination of chemical narcosis, so drugging someone really heavily, along with hypnosis. The goal here was to induce regression, literally force compliance, and then, this is absolutely crucial, induce post-hypnotic amnesia, so the subject wouldn't even remember ever being interrogated. And declassified files actually show they considered some of these tests on double agents to be successful in the short term. Okay, now we turn to what is undoubtedly the darkest chapter, Section 4, the unwitting subjects. Now, testing these methods on known spies is one thing, right? But to figure out if these drugs actually worked out in the real world, the scientists realized they needed subjects who had absolutely no idea they were being tested on. So the CIA moved their operations deep into the shadows. They started using federal prisons where inmates were given drugs like LSD, sometimes in exchange for lighter sentences. They also set up covert safe houses in major cities like New York and San Francisco. These were run by a hard-nosed federal narcotics agent named George Hunter White. And White's job was to secretly dose totally unwitting citizens and then sit behind a two-way mirror to observe the unpredictable and often deeply traumatic fallout. What's truly chilling is when you read directly from the primary source documents themselves. Take this CIA dispatch from January 22, 1954, discussing the Artichoke team's very first field assignment. Just look at the chillingly routine, administrative language they use. It says, "Herewith report of Artichoke team on first assignment." I believe it went extremely well. I mean, it literally looks like an everyday corporate memo you get from HR, but the subject matter is anything but routine. Because when you move to the next page, they outline the problem, attempting to use an individual to perform an involuntary assassination. If you read paragraph A, they actually propose using an alcoholic cocktail at a normal social party as the medium to drug the subject, apply these artichoke techniques, and induce an assassination attempt at a later date. Guys, they were literally planning out a trigger mechanism to create an unwitting assassin at a cocktail party. The historical record here completely speaks for itself regarding just how extreme their offensive ambitions really were. And on this final page of the memo, we see the absolute climax of this cold, bureaucratic detachment. Look closely at the text right there. After the act, it calmly states the subject would be taken into custody by a foreign government and thereby disposed of. Disposed of. This stark, terrifying reality is just sitting right there in black and white. Now, ultimately, they did conclude that the specific operation wouldn't work. But get this, it was due to operational limitations, not ethical ones. Which takes us to our final act today, Section 5, Exposure and Legacy. So, you might be wondering, how do we even know about any of this if it was so highly classified? Well, the year 1973 is absolutely pivotal. As the Watergate scandal was really heating up, the CIA director at the time, Richard Helms, ordered the massive wholesale destruction of all MKUltra and Artichoke files. He wanted this entire history erased completely, gone. But as you know, with any massive government bureaucracy, total erasure is almost impossible. Some financial and administrative files slipped through the cracks and survived. And those surviving documents were slowly dragged into the light, step by step. Step 1, you had journalists and researchers filing incredibly aggressive Freedom of Information Act requests. Step 2, that led to the 1975 Church Committee hearings in the U.S. Senate, which finally laid bare these activities to the American public and forced these officials to testify under oath. And finally, Step 3, all of this public exposure led to some major, sweeping intelligence reforms, including executive orders by Presidents Ford and Reagan that explicitly banned non-consensual human testing by U.S. intelligence agencies. So what is the ultimate takeaway from all of this? Like, what was the actual scientific reality of Project Artichoke? Well, despite the severe, horrifying ethical violations, the program yielded highly inconsistent drug reactions. They utterly failed to achieve any kind of reliable behavioral control. They never created their programmable Manchurian candidate. The only actual measurable result was immense, largely undocumented human trauma inflicted on an untold number of completely unwitting people. Which really leaves us with a profound historical tension. In the name of national security, at what point do secret defensive methods actually destroy the very values they are meant to protect in the first place? It's a heavy question that the architects of Artichoke clearly struggled to answer, and frankly, it's one that remains incredibly relevant to our world today. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the archives. I really hope this explainer leaves you with a much clearer understanding of this complex history and a strong desire to just keep asking the hard questions. See you next time.